What happens when a Hollywood icon, revered for decades, steps onto a stage where respect is just a punchline? Clint Eastwood, the man who defined grit in films like Dirty Harry and Unforgiven, walked into Jimmy Kimmel Live expecting to talk about his latest Western, a project he poured his soul into at 89 years old. Instead, he found himself ambushed by a host determined to tear him down for cheap laughs. The clash that followed left the audience stunned, the crew scrambling, and Kimmel's smug facade crumbling under Eastwood's unyielding resolve. This wasn't just a talk show gone wrong, it was a battle of values, old-school honor against modern arrogance, and it exposed a side of Kimmel that Hollywood won't soon forget. Buckle up, because this story is a wild ride, and we're diving into the chaos that erupted when two worlds collided. Eastwood strode onto the stage with that familiar squint, his tall frame moving with deliberate purpose. The crowd roared, their applause a wave of admiration for a man who'd been their hero for half a century. He'd come to discuss Riders of the Dust, a Western he'd directed and starred in, a film about loyalty and sacrifice in a fading frontier. But from the moment he sat down, something felt off. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips like he was sizing up an easy target. The host's opening words set the tone. "So, Clint, you're still making movies. At what, 102? The audience chuckled nervously, unsure if it was a joke or a jab. Eastwood's jaw tightened, but he nodded politely. "I'm 89, Jimmy, and I'm still here because I love the work." His voice was low, steady, the kind that carried weight without effort. Kimmel didn't let up. He leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief. "Come on, Clint, let's be real. Westerns? In this day and age? Don't you think it's time to hang up the spurs and let the young guys take over?" The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the seats. Eastwood's fingers tapped the armrest, a slow rhythm like a countdown. "I make films for people who value stories, not trends," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. The audience clapped, but Kimmel waved it off, scoffing. "Stories, sure, but who's watching? My grandpa?" That got a few laughs, but they were thin, uneasy. Eastwood's eyes narrowed, locking onto Kimmel, like a gunslinger sizing up a foe. "You'd be surprised who still cares about honor and grit, Jimmy. Maybe you should try it sometime." The host's smirk faltered, but he doubled down, sensing a chance to rile his guest. "Oh, I've got grit, Clint, but I don't need a cowboy hat to prove it. Tell me, do you ever get tired of playing the same tough guy? Or is that just what old-timers do to stay relevant?" The word relevant hung in the air like a slap. The audience fell silent, the air thick with tension. Eastwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near growl. "I've been relevant longer than you've been alive, son. I don't play tough. I live it." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others gasping, as Kimmel's face twitched with irritation. He wasn't used to guests pushing back, especially not a legend like Eastwood. Kimmel tried to pivot, tossing out a question about the film, but his tone dripped with condescension. "So Riders of the Dust, another cowboy flick. Did you make this one for the nursing home crowd or what?" The jab was meant to sting, and it did. Eastwood's hand clenched into a fist, but he kept his cool, his voice steady as granite. "This film's about men who stand by their word, something you might not understand." The audience oohed, sensing the heat rising. Kimmel's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl. He leaned in, voice sharp. "You calling me a liar, Clint? Because I'm just asking what everyone's thinking. Why's an old guy like you still pretending? He's John Wayne?" Eastwood didn't flinch. "I don't pretend, Jimmy. I tell stories that matter. You'd know that if you spent less time mocking people and more time listening." The crowd roared again, louder this time, feeding off the raw energy. Between the two men, Kimmel's producer, a wiry man in a headset, hovered off stage, gesturing frantically for a commercial break, but Kimmel ignored him. He was in too deep. his ego bruised by Eastwood's unflappable calm. "You think you're untouchable because you're a legend?" Kimmel snapped. "Legends fade, Clint. Maybe it's time you faced that." The words were a gauntlet thrown down, and the studio felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for Eastwood's response. Eastwood's gaze never wavered, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I've faced tougher men than you, Jimmy, and I'm still standing. You want to talk fading? Look at your ratings." The audience gasped, then cheered, the sound swelling into a wave that seemed to shake the stage. Kimmel's face flushed red, his hands gripping the desk as he struggled to regain control. The segment was spiraling, and everyone knew it. Eastwood sat back, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding, a man who'd weathered storms, and wasn't about to be rattled by a talk show host with a chip on his shoulder. As the producer finally signaled for a break, the tension hung heavy, a promise of more fire to come. The cameras rolled again, and the audience leaned forward, their murmurs fading into a tense hush. Clint Eastwood sat ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on Jimmy Kimmel, who was shuffling papers on his desk, trying to mask his unease with a forced grin. The commercial break hadn't cooled the fire between them. It had only stoked it. Kimmel, stung by Eastwood's jab about his ratings, came out swinging, determined to reclaim the upper hand. "So, Clint," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "let's talk about your legacy, since you're so proud of it. You've been making the same movie for 50 years. Don't you ever get bored?" The question was a barb, meant to belittle, and the crowd stirred, sensing the hostility. Eastwood's lips twitched, not quite a smile, more like a predator sizing up prey. "I don't get bored telling stories that stand the test of time, Jimmy. Unlike some, I don't need to tear others down to feel big." The audience erupted, clapping and whistling, their support for Eastwood like a wall closing in on Kimmel. The host's grin vanished, his eyes flashing with irritation. He leaned forward, pointing a finger. "You think you're above criticism because you're Clint Eastwood? Nobody's untouchable, not even you." The crowd quieted, the air growing heavy. Eastwood didn't move, his voice low and steady. "I've taken plenty of criticism, son. The difference is, I don't confuse it with cheap shots." Kimmel scoffed, tossing his hands up. "Cheap shots? I'm just being honest. People talk, Clint. They say you're a relic, clinging to a Hollywood that doesn't exist anymore." The words cut deep, aimed at Eastwood's pride, but the legend didn't flinch. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his gaze piercing. "People talk about you too, Jimmy. They say you're a bully who hides behind jokes. Guess we both got reputations." The audience gasped, then cheered, the sound swelling as Kimmel's face reddened. He wasn't used to being called out, not like this, not by a man whose presence filled the room without effort. Trying to pivot, Kimmel grabbed a note card, his hands trembling slightly. "All right, let's switch gears. Your new movie, Riders of the Dust. Critics say it's predictable, just another Clint Eastwood rerun. Care to defend that?" The question was loaded, a trap to make Eastwood squirm. But Eastwood was ready. "Critics said the same about the good, the bad, and the ugly," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "They said it about Unforgiven, too. I make films for the folks who show up, not the ones writing snarky reviews." The crowd roared, some standing to clap, their loyalty to Eastwood unshakable. Kimmel's jaw tightened, his control slipping. "You're dodging the question," Kimmel snapped, his voice rising. "You can't just lean on your name forever. What's next? You directing from a wheelchair?" The audience booed, the sound sharp and sudden, catching Kimmel off guard. Eastwood's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'd rather direct from a wheelchair than host a show that's running on fumes, Jimmy." The comeback landed like a punch, and the crowd went wild, their cheers shaking the stage. Kimmel's producer, now pacing off stage, signaled frantically. But Kimmel ignored him, his ego driving him to dig deeper. "You've got a lot of nerve, Clint," Kimmel said, his tone venomous. "You waltz in here like you own the place, expecting me to kiss your ring. This is my show, and I ask the real questions." Eastwood leaned forward, his presence commanding silence. "Real questions? You're not asking, you're attacking. I came here to talk about a film, about men who live by a code. You wouldn't know a code if it bit you." The audience oohed, the tension electric. Kimmel, now visibly rattled, tried to laugh it off. "A code? What is this? The Wild West? Grow up, Clint. The world's moved on." Eastwood's gaze didn't waver, his voice cutting through Kimmel's mockery. "The world moves on, sure, but respect doesn't go out of style. You might learn that if you stop chasing laughs and start acting like a man." The crowd exploded, their cheers deafening as Kimmel's face twisted with fury. He slammed a hand on the desk, the sound echoing. "You don't get to lecture me, old man. I've been in this game long enough to know how it works. You're not special." The outburst stunned the audience into silence, their eyes darting between the two men. Eastwood sat back, unflappable, his silence louder than Kimmel's shout. The producer rushed on stage, whispering urgently to Kimmel, who waved him away with a scowl. Eastwood watched, his expression unreadable, but his authority absolute. The segment was teetering on chaos, and everyone felt it. Kimmel, desperate to regain control, forced a smile, but it was brittle, unconvincing. "All right, Clint, let's cool it down," he said, his voice tight. "Tell us about your film." But the damage was done. Eastwood's next words would set the stage for an even fiercer clash, and the audience was on the edge of their seats, waiting for the legend to strike back. Eastwood leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury that silenced the restless audience. Jimmy Kimmel's attempt to steer the conversation back to Riders of the Dust hung in the air, a weak lifeline in a sinking segment. The host's forced smile cracked under the weight of Eastwood's unwavering stare. "You want to talk about the film, Jimmy?" Eastwood asked, his voice low, deliberate, like a judge delivering a verdict. "Then let's talk. But don't expect me to sit here while you sling insults and call it hosting." The crowd murmured, their anticipation electric, as Kimmel's producer froze off stage, his headset dangling in his hand. Kimmel's laugh was sharp, brittle, a man trying to claw back control. "Insults? Clint, you're taking this way too personally. It's just a talk show, lighten up." But the audience wasn't buying it, their scattered boos cutting through his words. Eastwood shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "I've been on plenty of talk shows, son. Carson, Leno. They knew how to ask questions without spitting in your face. You're not hosting, you're hunting." The crowd roared, their cheers a tidal wave, and Kimmel's face twisted, his composure unraveling. He slammed a fist on the desk, the sound jarring. "Hunting? You're the one acting like you're above everyone, Clint. This is my stage, and I run it my way." "Your way's the problem," Eastwood shot back, his voice steady but slicing. "You think mocking a man's work, his age, makes you clever? It makes you small." The audience gasped, then clapped, their support for Eastwood swelling. Kimmel's eyes darted to the crowd, his confidence shaken by their shift. He leaned in, voice tight with venom. "Small? Look who's talking. A guy who's been coasting on squinting and one-liners for decades. You're not fooling anyone, Clint. Hollywood's done with you." The words were meant to wound, but Eastwood's expression didn't flicker, his calm a stark contrast to Kimmel's rising panic. "I don't need Hollywood's approval," Eastwood said, his tone even, commanding. "I make films for people who know what loyalty and sacrifice mean. You wouldn't understand that, Jimmy, because you've built a career on tearing people down." The crowd erupted, some standing, their applause a thunderclap. Kimmel's producer signaled wildly for a commercial, but Kimmel ignored him, his ego overriding sense. "You're lecturing me about loyalty?" he snapped. "I've got a team that works their tails off for this show, and I don't need a fossil telling me how to do my job." The word fossil sparked a chorus of boos, the audience now openly against him. Eastwood's gaze hardened, his voice dropping, to a near whisper that carried to every corner of the studio. "Your team deserves better than a boss who throws tantrums when he's challenged. I've heard the stories, Jimmy. How you snap at your staff, how you ditch rehearsals to play king. That's not leadership, that's cowardice." The accusation landed like a grenade, and the audience fell silent, stunned by Eastwood's precision. Kimmel's face paled, his hands trembling as he gripped the desk. "You don't know a thing about me or my show," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're just some washed-up cowboy who can't handle a few hard truths." "Hard truths?" Eastwood replied, leaning back, his calm unshaken. "The truth is, you invited me here to talk about a film, then ambushed me to boost your ego. That's not hosting, it's betrayal." The crowd cheered, their voices a wall of sound, and Kimmel's producer finally stepped onto the stage, whispering urgently. Kimmel waved him off, his eyes locked on Eastwood, burning with defiance. "Betrayal? You're the one betraying your fans, Clint, churning out the same tired movies nobody asked for." The audience booed louder, their loyalty to Eastwood unshakable, and Kimmel's desperation was palpable. Eastwood stood, his tall frame casting a shadow across the desk, his presence commanding silence. "I came here out of respect for your audience," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "I've given them my best for 60 years, and I'll keep giving it, whether you like it or not." "You? You're burning bridges you can't rebuild." The crowd exploded, their cheers deafening as Kimmel sat frozen, his smirk gone, his control shattered. The producer grabbed Kimmel's arm, hissing for a break, but the damage was done. Eastwood remained standing, a pillar of resolve, ready to deliver the final blow in a clash that was far from over. Eastwood towered over the desk, his shadow falling across Jimmy Kimmel, who sat rigid, his face a mask of barely contained rage. The audience's cheers still echoed, a roaring tide of support for the legend who'd called out the host's cowardice. The producer, now half on stage, pleaded with Kimmel to cut to commercial, his voice drowned by the crowd's fervor. But Kimmel, his ego battered, refused to back down. He shoved the producer aside, standing to face Eastwood, his eyes wild with defiance. "You think you can stand there and judge me?" he shouted, his voice shrill, cracking under the strain. "You're nothing but a has-been who's too stubborn to quit." The crowd gasped, their boos swelling like a storm, but Kimmel pressed on, reckless in his fury. Eastwood's expression didn't shift, his calm a steel wall against Kimmel's outburst. "I don't judge, Jimmy," he said, his voice steady, slicing through the chaos. "I speak what I see, and what I see is a man who's forgotten how to treat people with respect." The audience erupted, their applause a thunderclap, some chanting Clint's name. Kimmel's hand shook as he pointed at Eastwood, his voice rising to a near scream. "Respect? You don't deserve it. You're a relic, Clint, a walking museum piece who thinks he's still the king of Hollywood." The words were venomous, meant to break Eastwood. But the legend stood unmoved, his presence a quiet rebuke. "You're wrong, Jimmy," Eastwood said, stepping closer, his voice low but carrying to every seat. "I don't think I'm king. I'm just a man who shows up, does the work, and honors the people who make it happen. You could learn from that, but you're too busy chasing cheap shots." The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the stage, and Kimmel's face twisted with desperation. He grabbed a stack of note cards, flinging them toward Eastwood, who didn't flinch as they scattered across the desk. "Cheap shots?" Kimmel spat. "How about the truth? Your film's bomb, your fans are dying off, and you're too old to matter." The audience's boos were deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to push Kimmel back. Eastwood's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I've outlasted tougher critics than you, son. My films speak for themselves. Your show? It's a house of cards, and you're the one knocking it down. The crowd went wild, their cheers a tidal wave, and Kimmel's producer grabbed his arm, hissing urgently. Kimmel yanked free, his face flushed, his control gone. "You're done, Clint!" he screamed, jabbing a finger. "Nobody cares about your cowboy nonsense. You're a joke, and I'm calling it like it is." The outburst stunned the audience into silence, their shock palpable as the segment teetered on the edge of collapse. Eastwood took another step, now inches from the desk, his presence overwhelming. "You want to call it, Jimmy? Here's how it is. I've spent 60 years building something real, something that lasts. You? You've spent yours tearing down anyone who threatens your fragile ego. That's not truth. That's weakness." The audience exploded, their cheers so loud the stage seemed to vibrate. Kimmel staggered back, his eyes darting to the crowd, realizing he'd lost them. His producer, now frantic, signaled for the cameras to cut, but Kimmel, unhinged, lunged forward. "Weakness? You're the one clinging to a dead career. You're pathetic, Clint, and everyone knows it." Eastwood's voice cut through like a blade, calm but unyielding. "Pathetic's the man who needs to scream to be heard, Jimmy. I came here to talk about a film, about men who stand tall. You chose to make it a fight. Well, you picked the wrong man." The crowd's roar was deafening, some standing, their loyalty to Eastwood a living force. Kimmel's face crumpled, his bravado shattered, as he sank into his chair, breathless. The producer finally wrestled control, shouting for a commercial, and the cameras pulled back, capturing Eastwood's unyielding stance and Kimmel's defeated slump. The stage was Eastwood's now, and the audience knew it, their cheers carrying the promise of a final reckoning. The commercial break ended, but the studio buzzed with raw energy, the audience still on their feet, chanting Clint's name like a battle cry. Eastwood stood tall, his gaze fixed on Jimmy Kimmel, who slumped in his chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the desk as if to anchor himself. The producer, sweating, hovered at the stage's edge, his signals ignored as the cameras rolled on. Kimmel tried to muster a smile, his voice shaky. "All right, folks, let's settle down," he said. But the crowd's murmurs drowned him out, their loyalty locked on Eastwood. The legend hadn't moved, his presence a quiet storm, ready to close the confrontation with words that would echo far beyond the stage. Kimmel, desperate to salvage the segment, forced a laugh. "Come on, Clint, sit down, let's talk about your movie like grown-ups." But his tone was hollow, a plea masked as a joke. Eastwood shook his head, his voice steady, cutting through the tension. "I'm done talking, Jimmy. I came here to share something real, and you turned it into a circus. I'm not playing your game." The audience roared, their cheers a wall of sound, and Kimmel's eyes widened, realizing he'd lost all control. He leaned forward, voice rising in a last-ditch jab. "My game? You're the one grandstanding, Clint. Nobody cares about your old man rants." The crowd booed, sharp and fierce, but Eastwood didn't flinch. He stepped around the desk, closer to Kimmel, his voice low, resonant. "I care about the people who watch my films, who trust me to deliver. You betrayed that trust tonight, not just mine, but theirs. That's why they're booing you, Jimmy." The audience erupted, some shouting agreement, their voices shaking the stage. Kimmel's face crumpled, his bravado gone, as he glanced at the crowd, seeing their turned backs. A stagehand, a young woman with wide eyes, watched from the wings, nodding slightly at Eastwood's words, her respect clear. Kimmel's producer rushed on stage, whispering frantically, but Kimmel shoved him away, his voice cracking. "You don't get to lecture me, Clint. This is my show." Eastwood's gaze didn't waver, his words measured but final. "Your show's only as good as the man running it. And tonight, you showed everyone who you are. A bully who can't stand being challenged. Now I'm walking away. Not because you won, but because you're not worth my time." The crowd's cheers were deafening. A tidal wave, as Eastwood turned, his stride deliberate, toward the stage exit. Kimmel, trembling, shouted after him, "Run away, Clint! That's what you do when you can't handle the heat." Eastwood paused, glancing back, his squint piercing. "I've handled worse than you, son, and I'm still here. You're burning out, and you know it." The audience exploded, their applause a thunderclap, as Eastwood pushed through the curtain, his team falling in behind him. Kimmel stood frozen, mouth open, no retort left. The producer signaled for the cameras to cut, but the damage was done. Backstage, a crew member clapped as Eastwood passed, whispering, "Thank you, sir, for saying what we can't." Eastwood nodded, his expression softening. "Sometimes you just gotta stand up," he said, then walked into the night, his dignity intact. The aftermath hit like a wildfire. Clips of the clash flooded the internet, racking up millions of views by morning. Hashtags praising Eastwood trended, while stories poured in from former Kimmel staff, confirming his backstage tantrums and cruel jabs. The network scrambled, announcing a sudden hiatus for Jimmy Kimmel Live, citing scheduling issues. But nobody was fooled. Ratings tanked, and Hollywood insiders whispered that Kimmel's days were numbered. Eastwood, true to form, stayed silent, letting his work speak. Riders of the Dust opened to packed theaters, its story of loyalty resonating with fans who saw their hero reflected on screen. In the end, Eastwood's stand wasn't just a win, it was a lesson. He'd shown that real strength isn't in shouting loudest, but in standing firm, honoring your values no matter the cost. Kimmel's mask had slipped, revealing a man undone by his own pettiness, while Eastwood's legacy only grew. A beacon for those who believe in respect and grit. The audience had seen it all, and they'd chosen their hero. What do you think of this epic showdown? Was Eastwood right to walk away, or should he have stayed to fight? Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe for more real talk, and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one.